Today we're going to begin the muscular system. The following slides go over the muscular system learning outcomes. Today we're going to cover 7.1, 7.2, 7.3, 7.4, and 7.5. First, in 7.1, we're going to describe the 5 functions of the skeletal muscular system, or the functions of the muscle system. Number 1 is to produce movement of the skeleton. Number 2 is to maintain posture and body position. Number 3 is to support soft tissues. Number 4 is to guard entrances and exits. And number 5 is to maintain body temperature. Make sure you know that. That'll be a test question. Next is the organization of the skeletal muscle tissue. Skeletal muscles are organs that contain a connective tissue, blood vessels, nerves, and skeletal muscle tissue. Tendons are where all the 3 layers of connective tissue come together and attach the muscle to the bone. So tendons attach muscle to bone. And aponeurosis is a broad sheet of collagen fibers that connects the muscles to each other. They're similar to tendons, but they do not connect muscle to bone. The blood vessels and nerves, there is a network of blood vessels in skeletal muscle, and the purpose is so they can provide high amounts of nutrients and oxygen. Skeletal muscles have high metabolic needs. Skeletal muscle is mostly under voluntary control. In other words, we are in control of our movement for the most part. There are some features of skeletal muscle fibers. Number 1, they're all specifically organized to produce contraction. So skeletal muscle contracts. They have specific names for general cell structures. They're very long and multinucleated. They're highly organized structures, and they're striped or striated in appearance. The muscle fiber is also called a muscle cell. In that muscle fiber, we have myofibrils. Myofibrils are the 2 filaments. Now, there are 2 filaments. One is a thick filament and one is a thin filament. They're called myofilaments also. Actin is the thin filament. Myosin are the thick filaments. And they're the contractile proteins that shorten and are responsible for muscular contraction. This shows you the active site of the actin, and then the inhibitors troponin and tropomyosin. This is the myosin tail and the myosin head. This wants to connect to the actin and then shorten or swivel in, and it's a hinge structure. Actin has specific active sites. They're covered when they're resting by tropomyosin, and they're held in position by troponin. Myosin, the thick filament, will attach to the active sites on the actin during contraction. Now, the neuromuscular junction is where the nerve and the muscle fiber connect. It's a junction where the 2 meet, or the nerve and the muscle fiber communicate. The axonal terminal contains vesicles, and those vesicles contain a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. That neurotransmitter will cross the synaptic cleft. That's the area between the nerve and the muscle. And what that will do is cause an action potential, which will cause the release of calcium. So what ends up happening here is the neurons will stimulate the sarcolemma, that's the cell membrane of the muscle cell or muscle fiber, by generating an action potential. That's an electrical impulse. Now, when that happens, calcium will be released down the T-tubules, and that will bind to the troponin tropomyosin, which makes the active sites of the actin available for the myosin cross bridge heads to connect and swivel in. And this is called the sliding filament theory. Now, when a muscle contracts, it produces tension. As fibers contract, tension is created by the tendons pulling on the bones. Movement will occur only if the tension is greater than the resistance. Those two highlights are test questions. Compression is a force that pushes objects. Muscle cells create only tension but not compression. Now, individual fibers, when they contract, they're either contracted or relaxed, on or off, all or none, and that's called the all or none principle. Variation in tension can occur based on three components: the amount of overlap of the myofilaments, the frequency of the stimulus or the stimulation, and the more frequent the stimulus, the more calcium builds up, resulting in greater contractions. A muscle twitch. This is another test question. A single stimulus contraction relaxation cycle is called a muscle twitch, and it's represented by a myogram. So a muscle twitch is a stimulus contraction and relaxation cycle. It's represented by a myogram. There are three phases in a muscle twitch. The latent period, that's the starting point of the stimulus and the release of the calcium. Then the contraction phase, that's where there's a development of tension, and then the relaxation phase where the tension decreases due to the restorage of the calcium. This is another test question. This is a graph showing you the three phases of a muscle contraction or a muscle twitch. There's something called summation and tetanus. Summation occurs with repeated frequent stimuli that trigger a response. This is another test question. Incomplete tetanus. It's near peak tension with little relaxation. And then complete tetanus is that the stimuli are so frequent that relaxation does not occur. This you need to know. This shows you summation where there's contraction, relaxation, contraction, relaxation, contraction, relaxation, building up. You could see incomplete tetanus with a small amount of relaxation, and then complete tetanus has no relaxation. This shows you the process from the spinal cord to the motor nerve to the actual muscle fibers. Next is muscle tone and atrophy. Muscle tone's primary function is the stabilization of joints and posture. Atrophy is when a muscle gets smaller. It occurs in a muscle that is not regularly stimulated, and the muscle becomes small and weak. Lots of times if there's an injury or if you break a bone in your arms in a cast, your muscle will atrophy. There are types of contraction. Isotonic contraction is when there's movement involved. Force times distance over time, or force times velocity. Isotonic contractions happen when the length of the muscle changes but the tension remains the same until relaxation. For example, lifting a book. Isometric contraction is different. It's when the whole muscle length stays the same but tension is produced, but does not exceed the load. An example of that would be a plank or pushing against a wall. Finally, during the elongation of a muscle after contraction, no active mechanism for returning to a muscle to a pre-contracted state is called the elongated state. This happens passively by the use of gravity, elastic forces, and opposing muscle movement.